Well, first tonight, I can reveal the outgoing Climate Change Authority Chair, Grant King, had spoken about a secret society working to overturn the government's ban on nuclear energy. With views like this, is it any surprise he was sensationally axed by Chris Bowen? This is a fascinating story. It's been big news this week that Chris Bowen replaced the chair of the Climate Change Authority with Matt Keane. It turns out Bowen's views on energy weren't aligned with the outgoing chair, Grant King. I'm going to show you video footage right now where King speaks about a secret society working on nuclear policy. But not only has Chris Bowen replaced him 4 years into his 5-year term, but the Climate Change Minister also launched an inquiry examining his integrity and potential conflicts of interest. It turns out, behind the scenes, Grant King had been advocating for nuclear energy for years. Have a look at this footage, the first time it's aired, where King says he was becoming increasingly frustrated by parts of the energy debate. He says very clearly that there's no good or bad energy and that nuclear should be part of the mix.
There's still a great desire to define good fuels and bad fuels, and that's not going to help us get there. We need absolutely everything working for us, and that also includes nuclear. So if we want to get into a debate, it's important that we throw nuclear into the mix and say Australia is going to have to come to grips with that issue and is going to have to decide whether or not it lifts that regulatory prohibition and allows the innovation and the investment that's now happening, particularly in small modular reactor technology, to be applicable here in Australia.
So that's the outgoing chair of the Climate Change Authority, who Chris Bowen has just replaced with Matt Keane. Grant King saying, right there as you saw, in 2021, just a year before the Albanese government was elected, that nuclear should be part of Australia's energy mix and that nuclear energy is important. The chair works closely with Chris Bowen, who has a very different view on nuclear, and so does the senior team in the Albanese government.
It's not just that nuclear is expensive to build. It's also that to make it work, it needs to force out the cheapest form of energy, renewables.
We can continue with the transition to renewable energy, or we can get distracted again by the nuclear fantasy proposed by those opposite.
What they have is a plan to wreck the future, a plan to drive investment out that is needed to provide that energy security and the lower prices.
But that's not Grant King's view, and in fact, he said he was increasingly frustrated by parts of the energy debate.
So increasingly, and I must say over the last month or two, I've become increasingly frustrated with the terms blue and green, because blue and green imply there is a better way of making carbon-free hydrogen, for example, when we use the term green hydrogen, than there is blue hydrogen. Makes no difference. At the end of the day, it's zero carbon hydrogen, it's clean hydrogen.
But he went further in the speech, with Grant King saying that the ban on nuclear in Australia should be lifted and that a secret society was working on campaigning the government over this.
That prohibition has to be lifted, and there is a secret society of people out there trying to figure out what conversation to have with government to lift that prohibition.
And in comments that also would have been at odds with Chris Bowen, Grant King advocated carbon storage.
Everything that reduces emissions is good. There's no good or bad reductions of emissions, and there tends to be, and the classic example here is geosequestration. I mean, every time that term is mentioned among some parts of the community, it's an oh my God event. How could we possibly talk about that? It's neither good nor bad. If we're storing carbon and storing carbon safely, that's as good as reducing emissions in some other location. And you can't get to net zero any other way than recognising that that duality exists.
Well, with views like this, is it any surprise that Chris Bowen replaced Grant King with Matt Keane a year early? Keane was conveniently on the same page as his new master.
In order to bring nuclear into the system, it would take far too long and would be far too expensive for New South Wales. Now, I didn't want to bankrupt the state, and I didn't want to put those huge costs onto families.
Well, Chris Bowen is so radical that being energy agnostic, as Grant King clearly is a crime. To Grant King, It doesn't seem to matter which energy methods are used as long as the emissions reduction targets are reached. But Labor has this illogical, ideological opposition to nuclear. And then there was also the complaint against Grant King by the far-left think tank, the Australia Institute, in May last year. Instead of just dismissing the complaint as nonsensical, the Albanese government actually launched an inquiry into its own Climate Change Authority chair. Now, political veteran Dennis Shanahan had this brilliant report in The Australian this week where he writes about how Grant King was shockingly subject to an integrity probe. He writes that in May last year, the Australia Institute asked Mr Bowen to investigate potential conflicts of interest at the CCA, the Climate Change Authority, and particularly Mr King. The letter to Mr Bowen also said members of the Climate Change Authority board should not also be employed by companies or organisations that could be affected by the CCA's recommendations. After a departmental review, Mr Bowen told the Australia Institute aspects of the regulations about potential conflicts of interest were not in keeping with requirements and changes had been made. So this is all what has unfolded behind closed doors. Chris Bowen ordering a humiliating inquiry into his own Climate Change Authority chair based on complaints from a radical left-wing think tank. Now, we know the Climate Change Authority itself is aiming for an emissions reduction target of between 65% and 75% by 2035. I've shown you those documents. And that's ambitious, given the 2030 target of 42% is unlikely to be met, according to experts. But it seems Chair Grant King wasn't green enough. Chris Bowen doesn't want energy agnostic. He doesn't want to even consider the advice of his top experts. He's driven purely by ideology.